Hey guys, it's me, and I'm here today to talk about Back to the Future Part 2, with Robert Zemeckis returning in the director's chair, and most of the cast members from the first one returning, minus Claudia Wells and Crispin Glover. Marty is trapped in another time travel shenanigan where he has to help Doc go to the year 2015 and save his son from going down a really destructive path, but along the way, Biff Tannen screws things up for the both of them, and they both have to repair the damage that was done by going back to 1955 in the same timeline of events that Marty was in the previous film. Back to the Future 2 is a very interesting film for me to talk about. This, I've often heard, is regarded as one of the best sequels that have been made in film history, up there with Terminator 2, Empire Strikes Back, and various other sequels. This movie, in many respects, is very iconic. From the hoverboard that Marty flies, the outfit that he wears, and the flying cars that we see in the year 2015, which was 5 years ago. 5 years too late reviewing this movie, but it's all in the past. You mean the future. Whatever! And it's pretty obvious when you watch this movie that there was really no intention to make a sequel after Back to the Future 1, because the ending of the first film is when Marty and Doc and Jennifer go to the year 2015, and it was treated as like some little joke, like, oh yeah, they're just going off on another adventure. And there really was no intention of it, but considering the film's success after that, studios were obviously wanting to see a sequel, and Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale were only interested in doing one if the cast was willing to return. Thankfully, Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, and the rest of the actors, minus Crispin Glover, were all willing to come back and return. Claudia Wells, who played Jennifer, Marty's girlfriend, she couldn't return due to personal reasons, so Elizabeth Shue, who you might recognize from Karate Kid and The Adventures of Babysitting, was signed on to play Jennifer. Doing a sequel to a very successful movie tends to be a bit of a tricky ground to walk on. We've seen some really great sequels in the past, and we've seen some not-so-great ones. When you follow up on a film that's successful like Back to the Future, critically and financially, it was inevitable that there's going to be problems and there's some kind of standard that it's got to live up to. But as far as my own personal thoughts on the second film, don't get me wrong, I have no dislike or hatred for this movie, but rewatching it last night, I was just kind of taken aback by some of the things that were in this movie that kind of went over my head as a kid, and was really surprising to see that it hasn't really aged that well in some respects, particularly in the future scenes in the year 2015 in the first act. And instead of staying in one particular place in the timeline, they jump in between three different time spans: 2015, 1985, and 1955. But the one thing that holds it together is Marty and Doc going through time, trying to stop something from happening, and then ultimately having to undo the damage that was done by Biff Tannen. So the movie picks up pretty much where the first one left off, minus Claudia Wells playing Jennifer. Doc shows up, brings Marty and Jennifer along, and they travel to the year 2015, where Doc informs Marty that his son, Marty Jr., is going to be involved in some kind of robbery which lands him in prison, which will have devastating consequences on his family. And since Marty looks a lot like his son, Doc uses Marty as an opportunity to take the place of Marty Jr. in order to stop the events from happening, where Marty Jr. was supposed to tag along with Biff Tannen's grandson, Griff, also played by Thomas Wilson, supposed to say no to all the requests that he throws his way. And during the sequence, as Marty explores the town square of Hill Valley in the year 2015, seeing all the flying cars coming in, the weird outfits that people are wearing, it's a little odd, but at the same time though, you could tell that Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale were having a lot of fun with predicting what 2015 was going to look like, even though I've heard him say that he didn't really like the idea of portraying the future because he knew that it probably was not going to be anywhere accurate to what he was predicting. But instead of going in the direction of something like Blade Runner, he wanted to portray a more hopeful and optimistic future. And you do see some of that as Marty looks around the clock tower. Everything seems really upbeat, especially seeing Goldie Wilson's grandson advertising a hover conversion car, and then seeing the fake shark from Jaws 19 popping out.
Shark still looks fake.
Then he goes into an 80s cafe where all the waiters and waitresses are talking heads on a TV hanging from the ceiling, and Marty gets to see one in the form of Ronald Reagan and some leader from, I guess, of Iran at the time in the 1980s.
Hey. All I want is a Pepsi.
Interesting to note that that Pepsi bottle looks a lot like those drinking thermoses that we have right now. It's one of the things that this movie does get right in terms of predicting the future. Obviously, nobody could have predicted social media and the internet. We don't have faxes. That's not a common thing. We can't get multiple channels on a TV screen all at one time. We got multiple channels, but not in the way that they show it. But some of the things they do get right, and probably the biggest one for me, as most people have probably pointed out, are the video calls that we see between Marty and his rival Needles, or his boss, who later ends up firing him through the video call. Not only that, but this movie does predict that the Chicago Cubs would win the World Series. They were off by 1 year too early, and it wasn't against Miami, it was against the Cleveland Indians. But, funnily enough, It is kind of cool to see how that turned out, even if it's played out in a slightly different way. But then there's the hoverboards, which is probably the most iconic part of the series besides the time-traveling car. And to my knowledge, there are some hoverboards out there, but they're nowhere near the capacity that we see in this movie. But the hoverboard that Marty ends up stealing from this little girl and he uses to get away from Griff and his goons, and also the power laces and the self-drying jacket that he ends up wearing. Can we have some of those anytime soon, please? Please? But in this sequence, he has to pose as his son, Marty Jr., waiting for a guy named Griff to show up, who's Biff's grandson. But then his son shows up too early and he's forced to hide during the confrontation. Marty Jr. is not really keen on the idea, but then being the wimp that he actually is, he decides to cave into Griff's demands. Marty then steps in at the right moment, takes his son's place, and then stands up to Griff saying no. But then we're introduced to a problem that was never mentioned in the previous film at all.
What did you call me, Griff?
Chicken! McFly!
Nobody calls me chicken.
So apparently, whenever somebody calls him a name, he has to prove that he's not afraid. That was nowhere in the first film. On the other hand, I do like it because it shows the character in a different light and gives him a new problem to deal with, which is later paid off at the end of the third film. And we recognize right off the bat that it gets him into trouble pretty frequently. Like when he finally stands up to Griff, he gets into a fight and by the skin of his teeth manages to get away. And he has the same problem with Biff in 1955, which causes Biff to steal the almanac again. And through little bits of dialogue that we hear from an older Lorraine, played by Leah Thompson once again, that Marty was involved in some kind of accident years prior, presumably after the events of the first film. At this point in the trilogy at least, that he was involved in some kind of car accident where he crashed into a Rolls Royce, and the guy who owned the car was so upset with him that he sued him for all kinds of reparations, and that Marty was just so devastated by what happened that he has spent his whole life since then regretting what he did, and he hasn't learned to control himself every time somebody calls him a name, which unfortunately ends up getting him fired from his job. Nobody calls me Chicken Needles, nobody! Alright, prove it. McFly, I was just monitoring that scan you just interfaced. You are terminated! Terminated? No! No! It wasn't my fault, sir! It was Needles! Needles is behind the whole thing!
Please, no, I cannot be fired. I'm fired. Ah!
And there's also some hints that he and Jennifer are having some marital problems in their life. And we, through Jennifer, as she's taken home by the police to their future home, she hears all these conversations happening and then later runs into her older self, and they both pass out. But Marty and Doc manage to get Jennifer back into the car and they travel back to 1985. But upon their arrival, they notice that something is completely different about 1985. The whole town is in shambles and it's underruled by Biff Tannen, who's basically become the Donald Trump of the town. He's a billionaire married to Lorraine, Marty's mother, and the house that he lives in is completely occupied by a different family. Mr. Strickland, the disciplinarian from Marty's school, has a shotgun and he regularly has to deal with gangsters. I've never seen you before in my life, but you looked at me like a slacker! All this happened because in the year 2015, Marty bought an almanac chronicling all the sports statistics from the year 1950 up to the year 2000, and he decides to bring it with him in order to place a couple of bets on sporting events knowing the outcome. Doc, on the other hand, was not too excited about that because he wanted to do it for the science and, as he says, gain a clear perception of humanity. Where we've been, where we're going, the pitfalls, the possibilities, the perils, and a promise. And perhaps an answer to that universal question. Why? Unbeknownst to them, the older Biff overheard their conversations, following them to the Hilldale neighborhood, steals the time machine, going back to 1955, giving his younger self the almanac, and created a completely different timeline as a result. As a kid, and even watching it now, I was very put off by the dark tone that this movie goes in, which I do kind of like that they show you a different side of Biff Tannen and what he was really capable of if given the right opportunity. He later ends up at the Tall Casino, which is actually in the place of the clock tower, discovering that Biff is his stepfather and that his actual father, George, was murdered some years prior. Murdered by Biff Tannen himself. Goes to show you just how evil Biff Tannen actually is, and it just makes me hate him even more. Speaking of that, Crispin Glover not being in this movie, it's pretty obvious, and it felt like the movie was really missing something, because he added a lot to the first film, and his arc, like I said, was so perfectly executed. Apparently, though, there was some disputes between him and the creative team. He wanted to be paid just as much as the actors, and he wasn't interested in coming back unless he had the right amount of money to be paid. They decided to just have him in the background for the most part, played by a different actor. And he apparently sued the studio for using his likeness without their permission. Well, look, whatever the case is with Crispin Glover, I mean, he's a really bizarre guy from what I understand, and he even tried to kick David Letterman in the head. You don't know that? Look that up on YouTube. It actually happened. But in any case, upon discovering that his father was killed, Doc shows up, having finally understood what's going on. He's able to illustrate to Marty and us, the audience, what exactly is happening. And just like the first film, without having to go in depth with the science of it all, the illustration is once again done perfectly. It doesn't rely on something big and logistical and very deep and thought-provoking. It's simple enough for the audience to understand what's happening, and as a kid, I was able to understand it perfectly. Oh, okay, so when Biff goes back in time, he created an alternate timeline. And ever since then, alternate timelines versus the main timeline has been a common theme in time travel, particularly in Avengers Endgame, which this film was used as a big inspiration for that film, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So in an effort to repair the damage, they can't go to the year 2015 because it'll be the same as the alternate 1985. The only way to fix it is to go back to the past, where the old Biff showed up to the younger Biff, giving him the almanac. So Marty confronts Biff, asking him what the deal with the almanac is, and he tells him the story of what happened, only then to pull a gun on Marty in order to keep him from talking to other people about how he was able to get his fortune.
Yeah, well, Biff, you're forgetting one thing. What the hell is that?
How does Biff still fall for that? So Marty manages to escape, and he and Doc go back to 1955, the day of the lightning striking the clock tower. And this is where the movie starts to lose me a little bit. I do like seeing the events of the first film from a different angle, and seeing things that we only heard mentioned off screen in the first film, such as Biff arguing with a repair guy who charged him $300 for the damage on his car, and him making moves on Lorraine, who was looking at some dress that she was going to wear to the dance. I really like how they were able to show the old Biff Tannen versus the young Biff Tannen in the same shot together. If you look close enough, it's pretty obvious they're two shots superimposed onto each other, but for the most part, it still holds up. Just like the flying cars in the 2015 scene, even though some of it's pretty obvious. And this, I think, was also done by ILM, which was a creation by George Lucas. The special effects do look slightly dated in some areas, but for the most part, they still hold up. And once again, the musical score by Alan Silvestri is fantastic. There's not a whole lot of new stuff in here, but I do like the musical cues that we hear as Marty's exploring Hill Valley in the alternate 1985. But even though I do like seeing the events of the end of the first film from a different perspective, like many people have pointed out, it does make me go, okay, I've already seen this in the previous movie. Couldn't we try something new? Now, I'm not necessarily somebody who wants things to be different and original all the time, nor do I want things to be safe and formulaic all the time, as long as the execution is done right. In this situation, I would say it's a good choice, but at the same time, it kind of works against the film. The filmmakers actually did consider having Marty and Doc going to the 1960s, showing us the progression of Doc Brown and Marty's parents' relationship, which I think that would have been kind of a cool idea to do that. But at the same time, though, we get a lot of great scenes from the 1955 sequence, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, though, it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. The first film was good, I know that, but couldn't we try something different with it? And they do try some different things with it, like older Doc Brown having a conversation with his younger self, which was just very surreal. And there's also moments like this.
Now why don't you make like a tree and get out of here? It's leave, you idiot!
Biff is such a moron. And it is kind of cool to see Marty and Doc trying to avoid their other selves in order to stop the timeline from being so messed up. Similar to Avengers Endgame, when they have to go back to certain movies in the past, where they're trying to avoid each other so that way they don't screw things up. I can do this all day. Yeah, I know. So Marty's able to stop Biff's goons from tackling his other self on stage, but then Marty's intercepted by Biff, who calls him a chicken and feels the need to prove himself. Then Biff ends up stealing the almanac back once he realizes that Marty took it. So Marty and Doc end up chasing him through the tunnel, and they manage to get the almanac back, with Biff crashing into the manure truck once again.
Manure! I hate manure!
I like to call it the Tannen family curse. So Marty and Doc head out to the remote area that they settled in earlier. Marty burns the almanac. He notices on the matchbook and the newspaper that he stole that they managed to change the timeline back to the way it was at the end of the first film. But in the process, Doc, who's stuck in the sky in the flying DeLorean, is struck by lightning, leaving Marty stranded in 1955. These last few minutes of this movie is so so riveting. Because when I watched it for the first time, and even still, it makes me go, my God, what's gonna happen? But then this mysterious figure in a fedora shows up, delivering a letter to Marty with specific instructions to deliver this letter to Marty at that exact location at that exact minute, conveniently enough. Turns out it's from Doc. Being the Doc that he is, has found a way to communicate with Marty that he's actually okay and he's in the Old West in 1885. Much to Marty's relief, he heads back to town to look for a young Doc Brown who's helping his other self go back to 1985. Marty shows up to Doc once again, who's just horrified by what he's seeing and naturally passes out because of it. And the film ends with the to be concluded title card and a trailer for the third film, which probably was not the smartest thing to do because it basically kind of spoils the third movie for you. Now, had they just left it at the to be concluded part and then the credits, that I thought would have been a much better cliffhanger. Nevertheless, though, I still think it's a good preview for the third film. I like the music by Alan Silvestri in that moment, too, but we'll talk about that in the Back to the Future 3 review. So Back to the Future 2 is not necessarily a movie that I dislike. I definitely think it's a good movie, but not that great either. I think it's a bit overrated, and at times it's really weird, particularly the fact that Marty's daughter is played by Michael J. Fox himself.
Mom? Mom, is that you?
What the And as opposed to the first and the third film, there's a lot more stuff happening in this one, going from 2015, 1985 alternate, into 1955. There's so much that's going on in here. And also, when we see the other Marty in 1955 coming back from the untouched timeline, at least for me, I've always wondered about this for a long time. Like, wait a minute. What 1985 did that one come back from? Is that from the untouched timeline, the new perfect timeline, or the alternate 1985? Like, when you really think about it, at least for me, it really doesn't make any sense. But thankfully, in this movie, they don't go too deep into it, so I'm willing to forgive that stuff. So Back to the Future 2 is definitely a solid entry in the trilogy for me, but the problems that I have with it, unfortunately, don't make it a great movie for me. But there's a lot of good stuff in it that I can enjoy, and thankfully the relationship between Marty and Doc Brown is still portrayed flawlessly in this one. So those are my thoughts on Back to the Future 2. What are you guys' thoughts on Back to the Future 2? Do you love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, comment below and tell me your thoughts. Stay tuned for my review of Back to the Future Part 3, and I'll see you all very soon.